Hey, good morning. Good morning. We're going to continue our Rooted series this morning. And over this month of February, we're talking about what it means for our church to set down roots in the city of Concord, to have a permanent presence in the city of Concord that leads to eternal influence. Last week, we started this series by looking at this first truth, that permanent presence leads to eternal influence. And this morning, we're going to be looking at this second truth, that permanent presence provides security in the face of the storm. And so we're going to be talking about storms this morning. And every single one of us in this room, at some point in our life, have experienced storms because of this. Storms are an inevitable part of life, aren't they? Storms are an inevitable part of life. And here's the second thing about storms, is storms, they have a way of revealing the strength or the weakness of our root system, of our foundation. So storms are an inevitable part of life. One pastor said it like this: you're either in a storm, you're coming out of a storm, or you'll be experiencing a storm soon enough. And that is so true. Maybe you're here this morning and you're right in the middle of it. You're right in the middle of it. Maybe you just are coming out of a season of storms. Or maybe this morning is just a preparation, because it's inevitable. There will be storms in our life. I think this is why so many commentators and so many theologians believe that the book of Job in the Old Testament, the book of Job is considered to be the oldest book in the Old Testament, in the Bible. And the belief is that was this story that was passed from generation to generation among God's people to remind them this is how we begin to respond in the face of storms. Storms are going to come. The question is, how do we respond to those storms? The second thing is, the storms have a way of revealing the strength or the weakness of our root system, of our foundation. I'm reminded of a story. Back in the early 1990s, my family, we were living in southern Indiana. And southern Indiana experienced a historical rainstorm. We had this field. It was probably about 3 acres out in front of our house. And in this field, we had a basketball goal. It was 10 feet. And it had rained so hard and it rained for so long that the water was up to the bottom of the basketball net. So the water was about 9 feet deep in our front yard, and it was coming towards our house. And it was probably about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. My dad comes upstairs and says, "Justin, I need your help. We've got to go outside. We've got to start digging trenches around the house." That's never a good sign. That's not a good sign. And so I get my raincoat on. I go down the stairs into the basement. And when I walk in the basement, there's about 2 or 3 inches of water standing in the basement. And I looked around the basement walls, and you could see the water was just pouring in the basement walls. And I learned something that night. And that is that storms have a way of revealing the fractures and the cracks in our foundations. That's not how a house is supposed to be built. That's not what you want the foundation of your house to look like, or how you want the foundation of your house to respond to a storm. But it has a way of revealing those fractures and those storms. I recently heard a story about a family, and this family, they grew up pretty tight-knit, but there was some tension and even some trauma in their childhood. They went through a whole lot as a family. Maybe you're here this morning and you can relate to that. And this family, as they grew up, they practiced this thing where they picked up the rug and they would sweep the trauma and the tension and the arguments and the divisions underneath the rug, and then just pat it down and pretend like nothing had ever happened. And so they became adults, and they would put on smiles, and they would live right down the road from one another, and they would act like they were best friends, and they would get together during holidays, and they would act like they were just this perfect family. This perfect family. And as time went on, one of their parents got really, really sick. And when one of the parents got sick, it started to apply pressure. It started to squeeze their family system. And when their family system was squeezed, when their root system, their foundation was squeezed, it fractured. It cracked. It divided their family to the point where it destroyed their relationships. And now they don't have a relationship with one another. See, storms have a way of revealing the strength or the weakness of our foundations, of our root systems. The psalmist writes this in Psalm 92, verse 12. It's these interesting few words that I came across as I was looking at storms. The psalmist writes, God's people, or some translations say the righteous, God's people will flourish like palm trees. Interesting. I never even considered that palm trees would be mentioned in the Bible, that palm trees would be mentioned by the psalmist. I kind of have this love-hate relationship with palm trees. A few years ago, Nicole's parents, they moved down to Florida, and we started going down there for Christmas. I'm from the Midwest, and in the Midwest, Christmas is snow and Christmas trees and Christmas lights, and it's about being cold, and that's what I think of when I think of Christmas. I remember the first time that we ever went to Florida for Christmas, and I remember driving in to their neighborhood, and I saw that people were hanging Christmas lights on palm trees, and I thought that was so ridiculous. So that's where my love-hate relationship started with palm trees. But as I looked at this verse in Psalm 92, I was like, why are they talking about palm trees? What is significant about palm trees? So I started doing some research. I started doing some research on palm trees, and here's what I found, and I've also seen this in my experience in Florida with palm trees. Palm trees have this huge bulb at the bottom of them, and if you plant those and you nourish and you take care of that bulb at the bottom of that palm tree, a palm tree can have a strong root system that can withstand almost anything that Mother Nature throws its way. But oftentimes, you can see this a lot of times in Florida, they'll build new neighborhoods and they'll bring these palm trees in by the dozens, by the hundreds. They'll bring them in and they'll just plop them into the ground, put some dirt on them, and then start building houses and move on to the next neighborhood. And what you see in those places is if you don't take care of the bulb of the tree, and you don't nourish it, and you don't spend time with it, that if a storm comes through, it just lays palm trees on their side. I mean, you can drive through neighborhoods after a storm, and it's just dozens of them laid down because you didn't spend time with the bulb of the tree. This is key for our church in this season of talking about setting down roots, is it takes time. It takes time to set down roots that go deep, that can withstand anything that is thrown our way, any storm that might come our way. It takes time. It takes time, and we need to hold on to that and trust that it takes time for our church to be a healthy church. It takes time to put down our roots. So palm trees have very strong root systems whenever they are planted in a healthy manner. Here I found a few principles that I think are important for us when I was looking at palm trees and the way that they respond to storms. The first is this, that palm trees have this element of perseverance. This perseverance about them. See, palm trees, they're able to handle torrential rain, wind, and storms because of their deep root system. A palm tree can withstand whatever Mother Nature throws its way. And I wonder if that same thing can be said about my root system, about my faith. I wonder if my faith can be described as having perseverance. Paul says that suffering or storms, that suffering can lead us to a place of perseverance, and that perseverance can lead us to having deep character or a deep root system. Can that be said about my faith? Can that be said about my root system? Is that how I respond to storms? Do I respond to storms with perseverance? Oftentimes, if I'm honest, I don't. Instead, I respond like the prophet, and his name in the Old Testament, his name was Jeremiah. The prophet Jeremiah in the Old Testament, he was complaining to God at one point. And he said to God, these are his words, he said, God, how long are you going to make me preach to these people that are unwilling to listen to your word? Now, don't take that the wrong way from me this morning. I'm not talking about you, but I have been in a place where I was asked to preach at this event. And I started preaching, and it was an event with 12, 13, 14-year-olds, and they were there for the music that happened before me. And as I was preaching, they got up one by one, groups of fives, and left. They didn't want to hear the word that I was preaching that morning. And I remember having this this heart attitude with God, like, why did you ask me to do this? Why did you ask me to preach these people? And that's what Jeremiah was doing. He faced this storm, and he wanted to know, God, why are you asking me to do this? If you continue on this story, God's response is so weird to me. God says to Jeremiah, he says, if you have run with mere men and grown tired, then Jeremiah, how will you be able to run with horses? What? I mean, is that a riddle? God, why are you responding to Jeremiah in that way? If you have run with mere men and grown tired, then how will you be able to run with horses? Here's what I think God was saying. This is what God was basically saying to Jeremiah, and what I think God is saying to me oftentimes whenever I face storms. If you're freaking out in the middle of these current challenges, how are you going to be able to handle the pressures of where I'm trying to take you? If you're freaking out in the middle of these current challenges, how are you going to be able to handle the pressures of where I'm trying to take you? See, storms, God uses storms. He doesn't throw them our way, but He can use them to grow us, to strengthen us, to mature us for where He's taking us. I want to look at this story in the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 14, and we looked at Moses and Israel last week, and we're going to continue looking at Moses and Israel over the next couple weeks. And here we are in chapter 14, Exodus 14, and we're going to be looking at verse 10. Let me set this up for us. I said this last week, but Israel, they've been under the thumb, and they've been enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt for 400 years. And they've been crying out that God would come and deliver them and set them free. And God hears their cry. And God chooses Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, you're going to let God's people go. And Pharaoh finally gives in and says, take them. You can have them. And so Israel is free. For the very first time in 400 years, can you imagine? They're walking in freedom. They're walking in freedom. They saw God do miraculous things over the past few days, couple weeks. They're walking in freedom. And then they come up to what's known as the Red Sea. And there's water as far as they can see. And they're not sure how they're going to get across the Red Sea. And at the first sign of pressure, at the first sign of a storm, Israel flips their lid. They freak out. They start to blame. They start to blame Moses. They start to blame God. And as they're at the Red Sea, then Pharaoh, he comes to his senses and says, I've let my entire workforce go. I've got to go get them. And so Pharaoh gets his army, and they're coming in behind Israel. They're in a tight spot. They're being squeezed in this moment. And they're not persevering. Instead, they're freaking out. It says in verse 11, Exodus 14, verse 11, says, Israel said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us? You see that? Pointing a finger, like, what have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? They continue, they say, didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to just be slaves, to serve the Egyptians, than to die in the desert. Moses' response is powerful. Moses says to Israel, do not be afraid. I would translate that as, let's not freak out. Let's not freak out. Let's pump the brakes. And then he says these two words. He says, stand firm. Stand firm. Persevere. Trust that God is at work right here. And then listen to what Moses says. He says, and you will see the deliverance that the Lord will bring you today. When we persevere, when we stand firm, when we rely upon God in the face of the storm, when we trust Him, when we're in the middle of the storm, it is an opportunity. It is an opportunity for us to see the work of God in our lives. The opportunity to see God do more than we can ever imagine Him do. To watch Him work in such a way that we couldn't even dream of. So in the face of the storm, just like a palm tree is able to stand firm, to persevere in the face of the storm, then we want to be the kind of people that also persevere when we're under pressure. The second thing that I learned about palm trees is this, that they have this sense of persistence. They are persistent. The definition of persistence is this: continuing firmly, even obstinately, on a course of action in spite of difficult situations. I love that word obstinate. I'm obstinate. I'm persistent. No matter what I face, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep pushing. That's a palm tree. See, in times of severe drought or dry seasons, palm trees are able to tap into this deep source of water that exists just beneath the surface. They don't wait for somebody else to come and pour the water on them. Instead, they are persistent by digging down deep underneath them and tapping in to that living water. It brings up the question for me, how do I respond? Am I persistent in that way whenever I'm in a time of drought or a dry season? And I realize that that's not typically how I respond. Typically, I respond in one of these three ways. One, I give up. I throw in the towel. I'm reminded of that quote, Mike Tyson, when Mike Tyson said, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face." And if you've ever seen a Mike Tyson fight, you know that if you got hit in the face by Mike Tyson, you'd probably throw in the towel too. And that's typically my response whenever I get in a dry spot or I'm up against pressure, I'm up against a storm, is I just want to throw in the towel. Another way that we can respond is we shift blame. Like Israel in Exodus 14, when they're like, "Look at what you have done. Look at what you have done." They're unwilling to take responsibility or figure out a plan to go forward. It's like, "Look at what you have done to us." We shift blame. This is probably my go-to right here, and that is we become a victim. We become a victim. And when we become a victim, then we villainize someone else. If I'm critiqued or if pressure is applied on me, and if I'm in an unhealthy place, often what I do is I'm like, I'm being taken advantage of, I'm a victim, and then I turn to someone else and like, "Look at what you have done to me. You just want what's bad for me. You want to cut my legs out from underneath me." So typically, instead of being persistent, we give up, we shift blame, we become a victim. But that's not how palm trees respond. Palm trees, they dig down in the face of storms. They dig down into their roots, into that living water that is just below the surface. Our scripture reading this morning was Psalm 63. In Psalm 63, the Message, I love how Eugene Peterson interprets this. It says this: "God, you're my God. I can't get enough of you." Listen to this. "I've been traveling across dry and weary deserts. I've been facing the storm." Listen to what he says. "As I face the storm, I've worked up a hunger and a thirst for more of you." So here I am in this place, this posture of worship. My eyes open, drinking in your strength and your glory. In your generous love, I am really living at last. That is a persistence, a faith of persistence, that when I'm up against it, when I'm experiencing a storm, I'm not going to blame. I'm not going to become a victim. I'm not going to just give up. Instead, I'm going to keep drinking from the living water that gives me life and more life. The third thing that I learned from palm trees in the face of the storm is that they are flexible. Or if you need a P word, it's pliability. Pliability. So they are flexible in the face of the storm. So they persevere, they are persistent, and there's a pliability about them. See, palm trees, they are able to bend under the pressure of the storm, but they don't break. They don't break because they are able to trust their root system that has gone down deep into the soil. They trust their root system. We, as One Life Church, we must learn to trust God in the midst of the storm, to trust God as our root system in the face of whatever comes our way. Matthew chapter 14, there's this story. And I think that it's a parallel story of Exodus 14. I don't know if it's just a coincidence that it's Matthew 14 and Exodus 14, but I do think that they are parallel stories. In Exodus 14, we have Israel up against it, feeling the pressure, being squeezed between Pharaoh and his army and the Red Sea. And they're complaining, they're freaking out. And then in Matthew 14, we have Jesus' disciples, God's new people, and they're freaking out under pressure. So let me set it up for you. Matthew 14, Jesus and the disciples have just fed several thousand people, and they're tired, they're worn out. So Jesus puts the disciples in a boat and says, you're going to go across the lake, and I'll meet you on the other side soon enough. And Jesus goes to spend some time with his heavenly Father to be replenished. And so then we come to this place, verse 24. The disciples are out in the middle of this lake. It says the boat was already a considerable distance from the land. So they're out in the middle of this lake when all of a sudden a storm comes out of nowhere, which is pretty typical in this area. The storms would just come out of nowhere. And then Matthew says this, that this boat was being beaten by the waves. Being beaten by the waves because the wind was against it. I love the honesty of Matthew right here. I love that he doesn't make light of the situation. It's not like that the boat was just rocking and the disciples were losing their mind because the boat was just a little unstable. No, it was serious. The waves were beating on the boat and the wind was up against them. I've felt that way. You felt that way when you're in the middle of it, when you're in the middle of that storm, when you feel like you're getting punched in the face. It feels like the whole universe is against you, doesn't it? It feels like everything and everyone has turned against you and you are all alone. And that's exactly where we find the disciples here. They feel like that the wind, everything is against them. Verse 25, it says that during the fourth watch of the night, so they're struggling, they're fighting the storm. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to be with them, walking on the water. I mean, of course he did, because he's Jesus, right? Doing what Jesus does. He can do this. He decides, I told them that I would meet them on the other side, and the fastest way between point A and point B is a straight line. So instead of going around the lake, Jesus walks right across the lake. And as he's doing that, the disciples see him. But I wrote down in the margins here in my Bible as I was reading that just last night. Jesus is walking on the water. I wrote right here, he does what we consider to be impossible. Jesus does the things that we consider to be impossible. We need to hang on to that. We need to hang out there, church. That Jesus does the things that we consider to be impossible. We might think that's an insurmountable mountain. That's too big for us. That's too much. We're not going to be able to accomplish that. But Jesus, consistently, we see him doing the things that we consider to be impossible. Verse 26, the disciples saw Jesus walking on the lake and they were terrified and they screamed, "It's a ghost! It's a ghost!" So they see Jesus walking across the water and they think it's a ghost. They think it's a ghost. I've always found that to be fascinating and a little silly. Why did they... this was a friend that they spent a lot of time with. Did they recognize him? But instead, in the face of their fear, they didn't see Jesus, but instead they saw a ghost. And so I started doing some research about that. Why did they think it was a ghost? And there's this popular Jewish superstition that holds that the appearance of spirits during the night would bring about disaster, could sink your boat. And so the disciples' fear was prompted by what they thought was this water spirit that was going to come and flip their boat upside down. They had an irrational response to fear. I can relate to the disciples in this moment. I often have irrational responses to my fears, to the storm, to the pressure. My brain goes 1,000 miles an hour of creating the what-if scenarios, irrational responses to fear. They're like, it's a ghost, it's a ghost. And then verse 27, what's the first word of verse 27? My favorite word, but. Favorite word, you circle it, underline it, highlight it, make a note of it. But in the midst of their fear, look what happens. Jesus immediately comes to them and speaks to them. Jesus does not wag his finger at them. He doesn't rebuke them. He doesn't yell at them. He doesn't walk away from them. Instead, that but means that Jesus meets them where they really are. Jesus meets them in their reality. Jesus shows up on their turf. That's good news, my friends. That is the gospel. That while we are in the middle of the storm, and we feel like everything is up against us, and we feel like the boat is going to sink, and we have these irrational responses to our fear, Jesus does not rebuke us. Instead, he meets us where we really are. And so he meets them there, and he says to them, he speaks to them. He says, take courage. Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Those three words in the middle right there are the key. Jesus says, it is I. In the midst of your fear, in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the winds beating against the boat, in the midst of the winds, the waves feeling like they're against you, in the midst of your worst moment, Jesus wants us to hear, I'm with you. I'm with you. And this is what enables us to be flexible in the storm. It's the permanent presence of the Lord. It's the permanent presence of the Lord that helps us and enables us to bend in the face of the storm rather than to buckle under the weight of the storm. It's the permanent presence. It's the promise that wherever we find ourselves, whatever we're going through, whatever storm is coming our way, that we can trust and believe that Jesus is with us. He is with us. I just want to cast some vision for our church as we close this morning. My friends, there is no mistaking that it's the permanent presence of the Lord that provides security in the face of the storm. There's no mistaking that it's the permanent presence of the Lord that leads us to eternal influence. But in the same way that the permanent presence of the Lord provides security in the face of the storm, in the same way, it's the permanent presence of God's people, us, His church, Christ in us, that can provide security for the hurting and the lonely and the broken people in this world while they are facing their storms. There's no mistaking that it is God in us, Christ in us, working through us, that as we set down roots, as we become a permanent presence in a neighborhood, a fixture in a city, that we become this safe place, this harbor, this security, this place of security for the hurting, the broken, and the lonely. Ezekiel chapter 17. Ezekiel chapter 17 says this. God says this about His people. Can we go to that slide? God says this. He says it, which He's talking about His people Israel. My people, you, the church, will become a majestic cedar or a majestic palm tree, sending forth your branches, and you will be producing seed. And it says, birds of every sort, or people of every sort, the broken and the hurting and the lonely of every sort, will come to nest in it or rest in it, and they will find shelter in the shade of your branches. The permanent presence of the church, of God's people, who have Christ in, it's Christ in you. Permanent presence of God's people can provide security, can provide a harbor, a safe place for the hurting, the lonely, and the broken as they're facing their storms. My friends, when we, the church, are able to persevere in the face of our storms, when we are able to persistently thirst for more of God in the face of the storm, when our faith has a pliability, a flexibility in the midst of the storm, then we become this place where people can turn when the wind is against them. We become a light, a lighthouse that shines into the darkness and shows them the way to Jesus. We become a voice of hope in the face of their despair. We become a people of joy no matter what circumstances they're up against. And we become an example of unconditional love to people who feel unlovable. Make no mistake, my friends. This is the vision. We're not talking about 4 walls and a ceiling, a roof. We're not just talking about a building and carpet. We are talking about creating a safe place, a place of restoration for the hurting, the broken, and the lonely. A place where they can come, a place where they can belong when they are in the middle of the storm. That's the vision. That is the vision that God has given us as a church. Yes, we are raising money to build, to purchase a long-term home. We are doing that. But it's so much more than a building. It's about people. It's about human beings. It's about creating a place of restoration for hurting, broken, and lonely people. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for the power of your word, the way that it speaks into our life today. Thank you that it is relevant. It is not disconnected from us, but it is speaking directly into our reality. Thank you that you offer us security in the face of the storm. You're not going to take the storms away. We're going to face them, but your promise is that you will always be with us. You will meet us in that place. And you are more than enough. You are our strength in all circumstances. So I pray that we, as One Life Church, can continue to learn what it means to trust that, to trust it and to rely upon it, and then continue to proclaim it to the world around us. It's in the name of Jesus that we pray. Amen.